Okay, I'm going to talk to you about Frankfurt today. Sorry, that's just an introduction. I'm going to talk to you about the drug policy of the city of Frankfurt. I'm going to give you a few words before I start. First of all, you'll need the word Bahnhofviertel. So for the ones with German, that's going to be pretty transparent, but it's just the neighborhood around the station, Bahnhof, so Bahnhofviertel. So that's the first thing. Then I'm going to talk about police crackdowns, about something they seem to call junkie jogging. Then I'm going to talk about drug-related overdose deaths. It's going to be fun, yeah. And then about multi-agency interdisciplinary cooperation. And then there's going to be something about Mondays, the Mondays round. In German, I think it's Montagsrunde. It's just a meeting held on Mondays. There will be something about methadone programs and methadone maintenance. And also drop-in centers, and especially low-threshold drop-in centers. Then I'll talk about needle exchange programs as well, about injecting equipment. I'll also talk about the Frankfurt resolution. More generally, it's about the Frankfurt way, so the method. And about consumption rooms. These are rooms where people can go to get their fix ready. And then there's one organization which is the Drug Policy Alliance, which is a US organization. But that should be about it. And this speech is going to be in two parts, so I'll stop somewhere in the middle. Okay. Right, still. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about the city of Frankfurt. I don't know if you know this city. I'm sure you've heard of it, and if you've heard of Frankfurt, I'm willing to bet it's either because of the European Central Bank, which is in Frankfurt, or maybe you've heard of it as a financial hub. There are loads of banks in Frankfurt. It's also quite a big city with a skyline, big buildings that we're not quite used to finding in European cities, especially not in Germany. It's also known for its trade fairs. There's a big car fair, a big book fair as well. So if you imagine a city with rich people, a lot of them, big cars, a very modern city, well, it'd be probably about right. And also, I think the image that everyone has of Frankfurt is every time Frankfurt and the European Central Bank are mentioned on the telly, we always see this big euro sign, this big blue and yellow euro sign. It's probably one of the biggest cliches of financial news. That's in the middle of Frankfurt as well. Frankfurt is a fairly modern city. It has a population of roughly 750,000 inhabitants, but it doubles during the day because another 750,000 people come every day to Frankfurt to work. And it hosts more than 400 banks, including the European Central Bank. It's a city I know fairly well because I had the good fortune of living there for a while. I spent 3 years in 2 installments, twice 3 years. And I must say, when I first moved there, my first impression of it was that it was a nice place to be. It has a lot of very nice neighborhoods. It's a very enjoyable city. But after a while, I found out that people in Germany seem to have a fairly bad idea of Frankfurt. Frankfurt seems to have a very bad reputation in Germany. For a lot of Germans, the city is associated with, crime mostly, and drugs. And I must say I was quite surprised, because the places I used to, go to and live in were all fairly tame and fairly nice. There was nothing dodgy about it. I think the reason is mostly that most of the people who go through Frankfurt usually tend to go through by train. They have to change trains at the main station. Frankfurt is rather in the center of Germany. So a lot of people have to get a new train in Frankfurt, and most of the time they'll have half an hour, 3/4 of an hour to spend there, and they'll just walk out of the station looking for a bite to eat or a place to sit and have a coffee. And if you leave the station in Frankfurt, what you find is the Bahnhofviertel, the neighborhood around the station. And that is very different from the rest of the city. In the Bahnhofviertel, you can, I think, find something for probably all the vices you can imagine. It's a neighborhood that is full of strip clubs, sex shops, brothels. In Germany, brothels are perfectly legal. And you'll find a lot of very dodgy people on the street. It's really weird because the station is right in the center of town, and the banking neighborhood is probably 300, 400 meters away from the station. And this is all just between the station and, well, basically the historical building of the European Central Bank. So between what is probably one of the most affluent places in the city and the station, you've got this absolutely awful place where most of the people try to spend as little time as possible. It is dirty, it's slightly scary at times. And the reason I'm going to talk about this place is that this Bahnhofviertel is emblematic of something which is called the Frankfurt Way. And, well, to summarize, it's basically that the city and the police sort of turn a blind eye on what happens in this part of town as long as it doesn't spread anywhere else in the city. Basically, until the 1980s, most governments, including Germany's federal, regional, and municipal authorities, tried to control the use of illicit drugs. And they tried to control also the harm that it caused by trying to limit the supply of drugs and trying to enforce strict anti-drug laws. These are methods that still continue to enjoy strong support in certain countries, in certain regions. You probably won't be surprised to hear that Donald Trump has been trying to implement very strict drug-free programs, and so far they don't seem to have much more success than all of the ones that came before. But an increasingly big body of evidence indicates that at best these approaches generate only limited results. That's at best. And at worst, the data suggest that these approaches are counterproductive. They fuel corruption in law enforcement agencies, they criminalize drug users, they violate human rights, and they drive risky behaviors underground where they can't actually be controlled or seen anymore, and they cut access for drug users to health and social services. And all of this, in turn, puts users and also the wider society at a greater risk. What was also seen in the 80s is that in many countries, and Frankfurt was certainly no exception, HIV and AIDS and hepatitis spread rapidly through the drug-injecting populations. And this had, of course, devastating effects for those concerned, but also for the general community and the economy. So what can you do? Well, better results can be achieved when the authorities adopt more comprehensive strategies that include efforts to prevent drug use and facilitate prevention, counseling, treatment and rehabilitation. And also they tried to have measures that reduce the harms of drug use. When we talk about harm reduction, what does that mean? It means that you try to have policies and strategies and programs that try to limit the adverse consequences of drug use. And these can be consequences in terms of health and also social and economic consequences. And you do, well, harm reduction when you find out that you cannot eliminate these risks, or that, well, maybe abstinence is not a realistic goal. But now let's get back to Frankfurt. In the 1980s and at the beginning of the 1990s, there was an open drug scene in the center of the city of Frankfurt. And it was concentrated in a park fairly close to the main station, but it was especially close to the banking sector. In fact, it was right in front of the building that was to become the European Central Bank. You remember the euro sign I was telling you about at the beginning of the speech? Well, that was basically there. And the traditional means of coping with this problem involved police crackdowns, and law enforcement would maintain a presence in the park. Drug users would then go somewhere else, and they would return once the police had left. This went on, and it was known in Frankfurt as junkie jogging. And it was certainly not unique to Frankfurt. Similar processes had been experienced in other cities, for example in Zurich, in Switzerland, at around the same time. In 1991, the number of drug users in the park reached its peak. There were about 1,000 people in that park. And also, and probably worst of all, the number of drug-related deaths in the city had an alarming spike. 147 people died of ailments related to drugs in 1991. By comparison, in 1985, it was only 31 people. Drug services could not really develop their support, and it became clear that the police alone could not solve the serious social problem. And a former senior police official reflected that, well, they, as the police, then had to accept that drug addiction was not a criminal offense, but it was a disease. However, since the end of the 1980s, this whole policy and this practice changed significantly, and I'm going to tell you how in the second part of this speech. See you soon.
Oh, wait,